All right, so here we go on chapter 21, which is the first chapter of Unit 7. So we're starting a brand new unit. Unit 7 is going to take us through quite a bit. It's going to take us from the 1890s all the way to 1945. So a lot of stuff is going to go down in Unit 7. But we're going to get started here on chapter 21, which is called An Emerging World Power and covers the years 1890 to 1918. So even though this is a brand new unit, a lot of this chapter is actually going to be kind of a continuation of the conversation that we were having towards the end of last unit. So a lot of the same characters are going to be involved in the story. Some of the same themes that we were talking about in last unit are going to carry over here. So it's a new unit, but there's going to be a lot here that's pretty similar. So previously, when we talked about industrialization, I told you that industrialization is going to be such a large kind of transformational event that there's going to be a series of kind of spin-offs from that are going to kind of draw our attention, and there'll be whole chapters about. So one of those spin-offs was urbanization. We did a whole chapter on urbanization that came about kind of as a result of industrialization. Then another spin-off was progressivism, which is kind of the reaction, as we talked about extensively, to industrialization, or attempts to try to fix some of the problems that came about from industrialization. There's a whole chapter on that. Now we're going to talk about imperialism and the United States kind of emerging as a global military power, which is also in some ways kind of a spinoff from industrialization. So we spent a lot of time last unit talking about how this kind of industrial boom, this industrial revolution of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s kind of um, allowed the United States to emerge as one of the global economic powers. Well, this chapter, we're going to talk about how the United States is going to emerge as one of the global military powers. So, really, what we're starting to think about is the 1900s is known as the quote unquote American century. This is going to be the century when the United States is going to become kind of the center of gravity for the entire globe, the global superpower, what in college they call the hegemonic power. So they like to use bigger words in college, which I guess is actually technically shorter of a word, but you know what I mean. So really, we're starting to have this conversation about us, the United States, emerging as this global superpower in a variety of ways. So economically, we talked about kind of we join kind of the elite level of countries through our industrial boom in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, early 1900s. Now we're going to look at how that also is going to happen from a military perspective. So, and again, it's kind of in some ways a direct result of that industrialization. So that's what we're looking at today. Chapter 21, An Emerging World Power, 1890 to 1918, America's emergence as a imperialist power, as a global military power. All right, so part one is called From Expansion to Imperialism. So, one of the things to note about kind of the United States emerging as an imperialist power, and I guess actually before we get into the details of this slide, we should kind of take a step back and make sure we have a working kind of shared definition of what we mean by imperialism. Basically, imperialism is the idea that a stronger, more powerful country can exert its will over weaker, less powerful countries. And that could come in a variety of ways. Specifically, today we're talking about military imperialism, but there's also economic imperialism, cultural imperialism, diplomatic imperialism. But primarily, this chapter focuses on military imperialism. So, what we're talking about here is the United States being the stronger, more powerful country is now going to begin to use its strength and its power to exert its will, to enforce its will, to coerce other, oftentimes weaker, less powerful countries to do what we want. Another way to look at it is, and we'll see this kind of become more and more clear as we work through this, the United States expanding the strength of its military in order to protect its global economic interests, right? So let's get into this slide, and that slide will kind of make that make a little bit more sense. But just generally speaking, when we talk about imperialism, it is when larger, not necessarily physically larger, but kind of more stronger and more powerful countries exert their influence and will over weaker nations. And again, it can happen in a variety of ways. This chapter almost exclusively talks about it from a military perspective. So this is a brand new thing for the United States to kind of be involved in international affairs. We've been primarily an isolationist country for our entire history. In fact, when George Washington left the presidency after a second term, very famously in his farewell address, and all presidents kind of do this address at the end of their presidency where they kind of warn the country about what they should be concerned about in the future. Very famously, George Washington warned the United States against two things, one of which was political parties, and we've seen a lot of evidence as to him being right about that, both throughout American history and in our modern day. But the other thing that he warned the country about was staying out of international entanglements. Don't get involved in other countries' business. Kind of stay focused on our own stuff. We have the entire North American continent at our disposal. Let's focus on that. And so Americans took him pretty seriously and took pretty much a full century to begin actually to ignore, or I guess to go against his warning, and begin to look beyond North America in some capacity, to actually expand our influence in other ways. So this is a brand new thing for the United States in some ways. In other ways, it's actually not new at all. So when you look at what's going on here, kind of the question being like, how did imperialism in the 1890s reflect both continuities and changes from earlier eras? Well, the continuity is that this is basically what we've been doing since day one. We just, as I said, had the entire North American continent to do it on, right? From the beginning, we've basically been an imperialist power, stealing land from natives, right? Going into these territories and areas that weren't part of the United States and taking them over, whether it's going and taking land from natives, removing natives from their land, going to war with natives, or picking a fight with Mexico. Remember, we talked about the Mexican-American War. We wanted California. We had already annexed Texas, which pissed off Mexico. We wanted California, offered to buy it from them. They didn't want to sell it. So we picked a fight with them and went to war with Mexico. So really, this is imperialism. It's just happening on North America. We don't have to send a bunch of boats overseas somewhere, so it doesn't look like it. But the concept of manifest destiny, which we talked about in the first half of the 1800s, which was that it was kind of God's will that we as a superior nation kind of take over the entirety of North America. That's not really that different of an idea than imperialism. And imperialism is really built on this idea, as you can see here, of American exceptionalism, that we are, in a variety of ways, better than other countries. This fundamental belief that we are superior, we are better, we have the right religion, the right, intellect, whatever. And you may remember when we looked at that painting of associated with Manifest Destiny, with that woman floating across the landscape, kind of looking angelic, like Lady Liberty. Everything behind her was painted light, and there were cities, and there were railroads, and there were telegraph lines, and there was advanced society, et cetera, and everything in front of her was dark and gloomy and uncivilized and kind of savage, with Native Americans and buffalo and wilderness. And the idea being that as the United States spread its influence across North America, we brought with us the light, as again the superior nation, a superior civilization. So that concept, that ideology, really at this point is just going global, right? And if you think about the timing of it, it actually makes a lot of sense. We talked about how 1890, really 1870s and 80s and 90s, while we were having our industrial revolution, all that other stuff in the East, in the West is when the Indian Wars were going on, when we were, as a nation, basically either obliterating Native Americans on the Great Plains, or forcing them into assimilation. And by the time we get to 1890, really fundamentally, as we had talked about, the Native Americans cease to be a free and independent people anywhere on the North American continent. In other words, by the time we get to the 1890s, we have the United States government has completely dominated the entirety of the North American continent. We have taken pretty much every corner, nook, and cranny of land from the natives who lived there before. Well, starting with the French and other European powers, and then from the natives who lived there before we got there, and then from the Mexicans in the Mexican-American War. So we had done everything we could possibly do on North America, and probably not coincidentally, right about that time is where we start to look beyond the borders of North America. We look overseas in some capacity. So it's really one way to look at this is it's an absolute continuation of what we've been doing all along. And let's also not ignore the fact that, and we'll see this kind of be a theme as we go through this, of course there was a racist component to Manifest Destiny. Of course there was this ideology that the Mexicans and the Native Americans couldn't possibly be, the ones who are supposed to be the stewards of the land or supposed to control the land, and that our society, which is better and more advanced, a white society, a Christian society, is obviously better. Those same themes are very clearly going to be part of what influences our imperialism overseas as well. So really, one way to think about imperialism is that it's nothing new. It's just Manifest Destiny gone global, right? This idea of American exceptionalism is the exact same idea of Manifest Destiny, going into countries that are weaker and have less economic strength and less military strength, and then pushing them around and forcing them to do what we want is really not all that different from what we've done to the natives into Mexico in the what would it be at this point, 110, 115 years since the United States became a country. So in some ways, like I said, the question is, how did imperialism in the 1890s reflect both continuities and changes? Well, the continuities are, this is exactly the same thing we've really been doing all along. We're just taking on a global scale. The difference is here, the thing that's new is, and this is why I said it connects back to what we had talked about, or that this is kind of a continuation of the story that we were telling last unit, is that industrialization really is a big influencing factor as well. Now that we have this huge industrial boom, it's not just that we're making all of these things in our factories and selling them to ourselves, right? It's not like all the things we're making in our factories we're selling only to Americans. As our industrial boom gets bigger and bigger, our exports get bigger and bigger. We're exporting all these manufactured goods all over the world. So increasingly, we have economic interests all over the world, kind of twofold, right? If you look at it two different ways. One, we're looking for new markets to sell our goods to certain places. And as we expand our economic interests all over the world, those economic interests need to be protected. But also, industrialization requires the use of natural resources. And so those natural resources can't be found within our own borders, then we have to go to other places and find them, right? So if there's a beautiful forest of truffula trees in Mexico, and we need truffula trees to make widgemahoos, then we have economic interests in Mexico, because truffula trees don't grow in the United States. They only grow in Mexico. So we need to make widgemahoos. And in order to make widgemahoos, we need truffula trees, and those grow in Mexico. That means we have economic interests in Mexico. Then once we import those truffula trees, we create widgemahoos, and now we're exporting them to China. That means we have economic interests in China because we are exporting to China, importing from Mexico, manufacturing something in the United States, exporting to China. That's a big, long supply chain that needs to be protected. And so you need a big, bad government. A big, bad military that is strong to protect your economic interests on a global scale. So that's kind of what's new here, right? That's point number two: new markets for manufactured goods and agricultural goods. As we are becoming a global economic power, kind of simultaneously, or at least following directly behind that, is us becoming a global military power. And that's why my definition before of imperialism being really a stronger and more advanced military to protect our economic interests on a global stage, in essence, a stronger military to be a security force to protect the economic interests of these big businesses. That's really kind of the birth of American imperialism, of America having a strong military presence on a global scale. So we're getting a stronger Navy in order to protect our economic interests. So again, in some ways, this is exactly the same thing we've always done. In other ways, there's some new components and new aspects to it, right? All right, so let's get into it a little bit more in detail. So kind of the first moment, kind of the big coming out party for us, like our big kind of like get out the trumpets, get out the banners, wave them around, and announced to the world that we are in this imperialism game, right? was something called the Spanish-American War. And so, there's a lot of other global superpowers that have been around for a while, and the United States has always kind of been like a, a side character, right? They've kind of been just one of the side stories in the movie of the global international community. But we have made ourselves more important economically, and now we are wanting to make ourselves more important militarily. And so, kind of the moment where we kind of um, like I say, make our big announcement to the world is when we go to war with Spain in 1898. And in essence, what happens here is there's the island of Cuba is 90 miles off of the southern tip of Florida. You can see it on the map on the left there. So Cuba is very, very close to the United States. Other than the Bahamas, there is no country closer to mainland United States other than Cuba that we don't share a border with. Obviously, Mexico and Canada. And then other than the Bahamas, Cuba is right there. So Cuba has long been something of interest to the United States as far as annexation is concerned. For a long time, a lot of the slave powers, when there used to be slavery, wanted to annex Cuba to make it another slave state, all this other stuff, right? And one of the products that grows, one of the crops that grows really well in Cuba is sugar, and it's a very profitable crop. So there's a lot of US businesses in Cuba growing sugar. Well, Cuba is not its own independent country. Cuba is a colony of Spain. And so there's a lot of American sugar businesses who think it would be really neat if we can get rid of Spain so we don't have to pay taxes to Spain and follow all of Spain's rules and laws and so on and so forth. And the United States could take over Cuba. So here we go, American economic interest on a global scale, right? And we're going to start to see some business leaders start to talk about the United States starting to kind of push its influence and its weight around to try to get to a position where they had control over Cuba instead of Spain. So we're going back to 1898. William McKinley is president. We haven't gotten to Roosevelt yet. We haven't gotten to Taft yet. We haven't gotten to Wilson yet. We're still back in kind of the quote unquote forgotten presidents. But McKinley is going to be one of the first kind of imperialist presidents. So what we're going to see during this time period is a lot of what we call yellow journalism, which is kind of sensationalized journalism, which is kind of embellished journalism where the truth and honesty and facts aren't necessarily prioritized, where a good story is prioritized. And so a lot of newspapers are going to start to get really excited about this idea of there potentially being a war in Cuba. So newspapers will start making all these stories up about the Spanish treating the Cubans horribly. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm sure the Spanish were not, warm and cuddly to the Cubans. I mean, it was a colony. They were exploiting Cuba, but the United States wanted to exploit Cuba. So a lot of the big business sugar guys are in touch with their pro-business friend, the pro-business President McKinley, who's a friend of theirs, and saying, you guys need to be paying more attention to this. Some of them are getting in touch with the newspapers, and the newspapers are kind of starting to showcase a lot of horrific conditions in Cuba. You can see on the images on there, it says what Senator Proctor saw in Cuba. So American senators are going down there and looking around and saying there's like concentration camp-like conditions for the Cubans and so on and so forth. So the United States kind of starts to enter into diplomacy, aggressive diplomacy with Spain about, let's kind of renegotiate some of the, specific details and all this other stuff. And things start to get a little testy. And the United States send a warboat down to the international waters around Cuba, just to kind of monitor the situation, not to invade, not to start a war, but to monitor the situation. And then that boat blows up. It's called the USS Maine. You can see the newspaper cover there on the right. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. So everybody automatically assumed that Spain blew up the Maine, which is the American warship. And as a result, we must get our revenge and go to war. The reality is, years later, they found out that the ship just blew up because the people who were on the ship very stupidly stored all of the explosives next to like the part of the boat that where you put the fire. I don't know much about boats, but where you put the fire to make the boat go, they put the explosives next to it, and then bing, bang, boom, the boat blew up. It had nothing to do with Spain. But in the moment, everybody assumed it was Spain. All the newspapers who wanted a war, because then people would buy more and more newspapers, and subscriptions would go up, and they'd make money off of it. And all of the sugar business leaders who wanted the United States to take over because they can make more money off it. Anyway, all of a sudden, all of these business interests line up to push for a war. This boat blows up. The American people all of a sudden are up in arms and saying, nobody messes with our boats, which is going to be a common thing throughout America. I think we probably already talked about it, but we'll talk about it continuously. Most American wars start because people mess with our boats. We don't like when people mess with our boats, right? The War of 1812, they were messing with our boats. This war, people were messing with our boats, and we'll see that happen more and more throughout American history. But anyway, and so next thing you know, the United States declares war on Spain, and the war does not last very long, and the United States whoops Spain pretty quickly. In fact, the Secretary of State, John Hay, called it a splendid little war. It lasts for 113 days. The United States whoops Spain pretty quickly. The war does not just take place on Cuba. It takes place on a number of Spanish controlled territories. It takes place on Cuba. It takes place in the Philippines. This is the war where I told you the story about Teddy Roosevelt just decided to quit being the Secretary of the Navy and just pay for a group of basically mercenaries to show up in the middle of the war and start fighting. And he became very famous as a result of that. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders who were involved in the Battle of San Juan Hill. But the point being, the war doesn't last very long. The United States whoops up on Spain. And this is significant because Spain was one of the European powers, as we know, that had kind of been dominant for centuries, right? They were where we started our whole story in this class, right? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and then kind of Spain set up an entire empire that took up, 90% of the Western Hemisphere. I mean, Spain was a monumental global superpower. And Spain has obviously been receding since that time. It's been 300 or 400 years, and they're kind of on the decline, and the United States is kind of on the ascent. So it's kind of this perfect moment of this up and coming country. Think of it as like the boxing match between the rookie and the old veteran. And the veteran's kind of probably in his last season, and the rookie's coming up, and everyone's a little shocked because they thought that veteran had a little bit more in them, but the rookie comes up and just whoops them. And this is kind of, like I said, kind of an announcement to the world that, hey, we're here now. We're going to pick a fight with one of the biggest, most powerful countries in the world, and we're going to whoop them, and we're going to steal their lunch money, right? That's basically what happened. So this is kind of stunning to the world, and it's America's coming out party. And as a result, as I said, the United States, like I said, basically steals Spain's lunch money. As a result of the Spanish-American War, again, of course, it's the Treaty of Paris because all of the wars end with the Treaty of Paris. The United States is going to take control over Cuba, which is where most of the fighting happened in the war, the Philippines, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, Puerto Rico, and Guam. And we'll talk about Hawaii a little bit more in a second. It's not actually part of the Spanish-American War, but it is at the same time period. So this is a huge moment. This is officially when the United States becomes an imperialist power. This is the first time we've gone overseas and roughed some people up and taken over. Again, it's not a new practice. It's what we've been doing to Native Americans and Mexicans and anybody else who was in our way in North America for a century or over a century. But now we're going and doing it overseas. So we have economic interest in Cuba, obviously, because that's where the sugar plantations were. We have economic interest in the Philippines. The reason we have economic interest in the Philippines is because if you look at that map there, all those orange islands are the Philippines, but that big green piece of land, as I'm sure you all know, right above it is China. And China is a treasure chest from an economic perspective at that point in world history. So having control of land that's just a hop, skip, and a jump from China is a huge benefit to the United States as a growing economic power in the world. And then we also get control of Puerto Rico, which is right there in the Caribbean, right in our backyard, and then also Guam. So really, like I said, this is a huge turning point for the United States, kind of on the global scale. Like just we picked a fight with Spain, right? Like the analogy I like to use on this one is, this is kind of like, in one of those high school teen movies, where, and if you don't like my analogies, you could probably fast forward like 2 minutes here and then skip this part. But anyway, where like, it's like one of those high school teen movies and everybody's hanging out in the cafeteria and like all of the cool kids are on the football team and they all like are like super cool and they're like the alpha males of the school or whatever. And then there's that kid that always kind of sits in the cafeteria by himself and never really talks to anybody. Nobody pays attention to him. And then one day he just stands up in the middle of lunch, walks up to like the wide receiver of the football team and says, "Yo, give me your lunch." And the wide receiver is like, "What are you talking about? Like, get the hell out of my way, you punk." And nobody would imagine it, but all of a sudden that kid that doesn't have any friends, never talks to anybody, and just sits by himself in the cafeteria, just whoops the wide receiver in the middle of the cafeteria in front of the whole school, embarrassing the wide receiver, surprising everybody, and legit taking the wide receiver's lunch. They took their pizza, they took their brownie, their apple, their chocolate milk, or whatever the hell people get for lunch at school, right? And that's what this is: Cuba, Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. I mean, the United States just whooped them and took their lunch money, and the whole school was put on notice. Like, okay, that kid who sits in the corner by himself, that kid can fight and is willing to and is ready to go, right? Ready to make a name for himself. So that's kind of the Spanish-American War. It's a significant war. It doesn't get a ton of attention normally, but I think it deserves it because it's a significant war as far as a huge turning point for the United States. It's going to really be our kind of first kind of adventure into imperialism and really kind of set us off as an imperialist nation. Now, remember, our working definition of I gave you two, but our working definition of imperialism, one of them is that the United States is going to use its military to protect or expand its economic interest on a global scale, right? So that's exactly what this is, right? Spain wasn't doing anything to us. They didn't attack us. They weren't messing with any of our stuff. We wanted we wanted more control over the Cuban sugar plantations. And as a result of the war, we also found an opportunity to be able to get a foothold in the Philippines, just off of the coast of China. So this is 100% driven by nothing other than the United States wanting to expand its economic interest and using our military as an opportunity to do so. Now, that's not what we said it was, right? If you go back to the previous slide, or a couple slides back, the whole thing was being sold as a humanitarian effort. We had to go save the poor Cubans from the evil, dastardly Spanish who were treating them so poorly. We need to go free the Cubans. Well, the thing that's funny about that is after the war's over, Cuba's like, "Oh my God, thank you so much. Now we have our independence. Like, you guys are the best. Spain is gone. So, you guys can go home now." And we're like, well, the funny thing about that is we're not going home, right? We were just kind of pretending that we wanted to free you guys from Spain. We just want to get them out of the way so we can control you guys. So the United States will not leave Cuba until something is added to the Cuban Constitution. So Cuba will actually become technically a free and independent country, and they will create a new constitution. But they will write that constitution under the very watchful eye of the American military. And the American military and government will force Cuba to add something to their constitution called the Platt Amendment. And what the Platt Amendment basically says is, and this was written in the constitution of the brand new Cuban nation, that the United States has the right to basically invade and take over Cuba if at any point Cuba does something that they don't like. So technically, legally, Cuba is an independent country, but the reality is, of course, that the United States very obviously has complete control over Cuba, and the sugar planters and those big businesses are really the ones that are running the show. And we will see a very pro-American government in Cuba for a half a century. It won't be until the 1950s where there'll be a revolution in Cuba to overthrow the pro-American government, and that'll make things complicated, but that'll be for a future chapter. But for now, we have basically installed a government in Cuba that is technically independent, but very, very American friendly. And of course, the Platt Amendment, as I said, legally gives the United States to kind of take over the Cuban government if we don't like what Cuba is doing. So we mentioned before that the Secretary of State called the Spanish-American War a splendid little war. There weren't a ton of casualties. It didn't take that long. 113 days, was that a little bit less than 4 months? And as a result, the United States gained all of this land. So it seems pretty clean, pretty easy, not a whole lot of people hurt. Well, the reality is, it's interesting because I said a moment ago, the Spanish American War doesn't get a ton of attention. Well, what gets even less attention, heartbreakingly so, is what follows the Spanish American War. Because the same way that the Cubans kind of had this idea that maybe now they have their freedom, now that Spain was kicked out, maybe then now they have their freedom, and then very quickly realize, no, the United States is really just replacing Spain as your kind of overlords. Same thing happens in the Philippines. In the Philippines, people were kind of like ready to celebrate. Thank you, United States. You got rid of Spain. Now we could be independent. And the United States is actually going to not even go as far as they did with Cuba. Like with Cuba, they technically gave Cuba their independence, even though we know that the United States essentially still controlled it. They won't even technically give Philippines their independence. They're going to keep control of the Philippines. The Philippines will straight up become a colony of the United States. Well, the Filipino people don't like that and they fight back. They're inspired to fight now. And this leads to something called the Philippine-American War, which, like I said, gets almost no attention whatsoever in most history classes or history books. And the thing that's worth noting about this is the Spanish-American War gets a little bit of attention, and it lasted for 113 days, and there were a ton of casualties. The Philippine-American War is going to last for 3 years. There'll be over 4,000 American deaths and over 200,000 Filipino deaths. It is a brutal, awful, horrific war for the Filipino people, and eventually they will surrender and submit to American control. So this is a very clear sign that the United States is willing to use military force and brutality and violence in order to achieve their economic goals. And in this case, the Philippines was all about really just an entryway to China. And so there's going to be a lot of Americans who are going to be upset about what goes on in the Philippines. It's going to start to inspire an anti-imperialist movement. So very soon after the United States becomes an imperialist power, there's going to be a strong anti-imperialist movement within the United States. Some of the leading anti-imperialists are Mark Twain, famous writer, Jane Addams, who we talked about before, who started a Whole House, who's now going to become a kind of more of a political advocate. Samuel Gompers, who was one of the labor leaders during this time period, and Andrew Carnegie, who was one of the big fat cat captain of industry. So this is a pretty diverse group of people. And of course, hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of others are going to have are going to be concerned about American imperialism as well. But just that kind of list of very well-known names is a pretty diverse list. But this Filipino-American War is really a clear sign of the very beginning of American and military adventures, that you can try to sell it as we did with Cuba and as we do with the Philippines, that, well, it's important that the United States keep control and keep power. And this is built into that American exceptionalism thing and built into that kind of racist, kind of paternal racist component of it is, we want to give you your independence, but I think we all know that you can't really control your own nation, right? Because, your skin's too dark, and that means you're probably not that bright, and all those other kind of racist, stereotypes and BS that existed back then, obviously still exists now to some component. But anyway, and who knows how much people actually believe that versus how much it was just a cover. But the reality was that the United States was going to maintain control over Cuba and maintain control of the Philippines. And in the Philippines, we see a very, very strong resistance. This resistance is going to lead to a lot of violence and a lot of deaths, sadly, for the Filipino people. Eventually, Teddy Roosevelt, remember our old friend Teddy Roosevelt, will put William Howard Taft in charge. They'll make him the governor of the Philippines. And remember, Taft wanted to be, I told you before, he wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, and Teddy said he'd make him one, but then he's like, I really need you to go be the governor of the Philippines. And this is actually the first time that the relationship between the American government and the Filipino people was actually very positive. Most of the Filipino people really, really liked William Howard Taft. And when he was done with his governorship and he left, it then led to the relationship between the United States and the Philippines being bad again. But the control of the Philippines is going to last for quite a few decades. I think it won't be until World War II. I may be wrong about that, where the United States will finally relent and give the Filipino people their independence. But this is what American imperialism looks like, right? This is as much as you can claim that we're going to these countries to liberate them and to free them from, Spain or whatever other kind of excuse we'll use as we move forward, this is what true American imperialism looks like. It is brutal, it is bloody, it is violent. And again, the ultimate goal is for our economic interests. Before the Spanish-American War, so this is actually going to predate the story we just told, we had another island area, just like Cuba. Wasn't nearly as close as Cuba, but that had a lot of American business sugar interests, and that is, of course, the islands of Hawaii. So that was an independent nation, right? And there was a lot of, as I said, sugar planters and plantations there. And same story as Cuba. Over time, they were going to become, kind of more greedy, these sugar planters, and wanting more control, not wanting to pay taxes, and not wanting to kind of have to go along with whatever the government of Hawaii was telling them. The Queen Liliuokalani, I think is her name, something like that. Queen Liliuokalani was very firm in enforcing certain rules and regulations against sugar plantations to make sure that the people of Hawaii weren't being kind of exploited by these American businessmen. And slowly but surely, these American businessmen again begin to kind of call out to the American government at the time and say, hey, we think that we should overthrow the government of Hawaii and take this over and annex it as part of our land. And at first, the American government was like, no, I don't think we should do that. And the American president kind of rejected it. But then kind of the military forces that were there just kind of took it upon themselves to overthrow the monarchy of Hawaii. And as this kind of debate begins to open up about whether or not we should, give the Hawaiian people back their independence or annex it, you can see the way that one American congressman described the situation. He said Hawaii's monarchy was an absurd, grotesque, and tottering government, and that the Aryan race would rescue the islands. So again, we're kind of making sure that we understand that so much of the one of the largest, strongest components of this whole imperialist kind of perspective is 100% built in to racist ideas, just like it was with we got to take the land from the natives because they're not using it correctly, just like it was with we're going to take the land from the Mexicans. It's this idea that look at the way that the monarchy is being described, absurd, grotesque, and tottering. And clearly the Aryan race, meaning white race, will rescue the islands, that we are better, we are more advanced, we are superior in some way. They're not doing what they should be doing. They're not exploiting the natural resources as much as they could be. So we need to take it over. Eventually that argument will succeed and the United States will annex Hawaii in 1898. Eventually Hawaii will become one of the 50 states, I think in like the 1940s or something. But this is all part of these kind of first stages of American imperialism, whether it's in Hawaii or Cuba or the Philippines. The same story applies. We are going to use the American military in order to advance American economic interests. And in all of these cases, it is a bigger, stronger country exerting its will over weaker, less strong nations, right? So this is what imperialism looks like in the United States, as I said, is really going to get going in the 1890s. That brings us to part two. We get to part two, we're going to start to look at, as we get beyond the 1890s into the 1900s, and we start to look at the progressive presidents, right? Those three progressive presidents who believed that we should have a big, strong, robust nation that was very active in trying to protect the American people against the power of big business. However, it's going to be very interesting, as we'll see. It's going to start to get a little complicated when it comes to foreign policy, because there's still a belief in a big, active, and robust government. However, in this case, it will be to promote the interests of American businesses on a global stage. So these progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft to a degree, Woodrow Wilson to a degree, but definitely Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is a enthusiastic, frothing at the mouth, energetic imperialist. He loves it. He's all about it. He's as McKinley kind of is the one that gets kind of American imperialism going. But boy, oh boy, will Teddy Roosevelt just really start rocking and rolling on it. He's going to go 100 miles an hour and do everything he can to turn the United States into an imperialist power. And that's a lot of what the focus of part 2 is about. So this actually, the open door policy and the Boxer Rebellion actually predates Teddy Roosevelt. But it's another example in another part of the world in which the United States will, again, to keep kind of drilling into this definition, use its military power to either support or expand its economic interests. So what's going on in China right now? So the United States is kind of late to this game of imperialism, right? We know these European powers have been doing this imperialist thing for a long time. And as I mentioned before, when I was talking about the Philippines, China is basically this kind of treasure chest. There's so many natural resources in China, so many markets to be able to sell your stuff. China is this incredibly important and incredibly attractive place for countries to be able to do business. So by the time the United States kind of starts to get into the imperialist game, most of the other major European powers of the world have kind of carved up China into a series of spheres of influence. In other words, Russia's like, hey, we'll kind of, this is our area, everybody else back off. England's like, well, this is our area, everybody else back off. France is like, well, this is our area, everybody else back off, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see that political cartoon on the left kind of showcases this. Each of those animals represent a different major global power. And obviously all of them are kind of, aggressively contending to see who gets to control China. Well, as I said, they had kind of cleanly divided it up into different spheres of influence and said, okay, I'll stay out of your way, you stay out of my way. This is my part of China where I do business, and this is your part of China where you do business. Well, now that the United States has come on the scene, they're like, well, where's our part of China where we get to do business? Everybody's like, sorry, bro, we already divided it all up. So the United States started advocating for something called an open door policy, basically saying, no, we shouldn't have this spheres of influence thing. We shouldn't have it so like this, there's 7 people at the party and there's 6 pieces of cake and I don't get a piece of cake because, I'm the last one here. We should all just grab forks and dig in wherever we want to dig in. It's an open door policy. Forget about the spheres of influence. Let anybody do business with China or wherever and however they want. Well, of all these strong powers, all these other countries are not obviously going to be like, well, okay, that sounds good. Why don't you do that? They're going to resist it. The United States is going to get its opportunity in 1900 because there's going to be a near civil war that breaks out in China. It won't be a full-on civil war, but there'll be a rebellion against the government. So there'll be it's called the Boxer Rebellion. The rebels are called the Boxers, and they're going to try to rise up and overthrow the nationalist government in China. So this is an opportunity for the United States to use its military power in order to expand its economic interests. Now, this time it's going to look a little bit different than we've seen in the other times. This time it's not going to be a go about push around the government like we pushed around Spain, or we pushed around Cuba, or we pushed around the Philippines, or we pushed around Hawaii. This time it's actually going to be to support the Chinese government, to say, okay, look, you guys are facing a rebellion. We will send our military in. We will give you military aid. We'll give you financial aid. We will help protect your government. But you have to kind of give us a foot into the market. You have to let us in. So the United States uses military power to help the Chinese government put down the Boxer Rebellion, but thereby creating a relationship with the Chinese government that allowed the American businesses to have access to Chinese markets and kind of create that open door policy that they had been hoping for. So it's different, right? It's not the same everywhere you look. Like in Cuba, in Cuba, it is mostly just about kicking Spain out and then taking over. In the Philippines, is about kicking Spain out and then putting down the rebellion. In Hawaii, it was about overthrowing the monarchy who is there. And here, it's about actually helping the government of the country that we want to have economic access to solve their problems so that they can then give us what we want there. But even as each of these is a little bit different from one another, each of these examples of imperialism, it all fundamentally gets back to the same thing, which again is the United States using its military power to expand, support, or expand its economic interests. So it's exactly what happened in Cuba, it's exactly what happened in the Philippines, exactly what happened in Hawaii, and it's exactly what happened in China. So now we're going to get to our old friend, Teddy Roosevelt. So there you see Teddy Roosevelt in the middle. That's a political cartoon that is showcasing a very famous quote from Teddy Roosevelt, which he says about American foreign policy, that we should speak softly and carry a big stick. In other words, he believed that we should have a very big, very powerful Navy, but we should always start with diplomacy. So in other words, it's about kind of going into a nation and saying, hey, let's open up negotiations. Let's talk about, how the United States and whatever country we're talking to can go into business with one another or make some sort of a deal. But always with the understanding that if you don't like the deal we're proposing diplomatically, we have this big old Navy that we can use. So it'd be kind of like if I, it's like, hey, anybody here want to buy my daughter's Girl Scout cookies? I'm selling them for $5, and I'd rather us make a deal and everything's good and we're getting along with one another, and you give me the $5 and I give you the cookies. And if you don't want to buy them, then I'll get out a big bat and I'll threaten to crack your skull open, right? So it's like we could do this the easy way or the hard way, right? Kind of a good cop, bad cop situation. So Teddy Roosevelt was an aggressive bully when it came to imperialism. And he created something called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, but oftentimes just called the Roosevelt Corollary. You probably don't remember, but in the 1820s, Secretary of State James Monroe, who will later become president, created something called the Monroe Doctrine, which basically told the European countries, hey, stay out of the Caribbean because we're going to protect these smaller, weaker countries. A lot of these countries in the 1800s in the Caribbean and Central America had started to try to have their own wars for independence and try to get off from under the colonization of European countries. And the United States under Monroe basically said, yes, we are going to protect all of these countries in the Western Hemisphere from European power. Now, a little bit under 100 years later, Teddy Roosevelt's going to create something called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And basically what that does is it kind of turns the Monroe Doctrine on its head and very paternalistically says, if any of these countries, because he basically is doubling down on this idea that it is the United States' job to protect these countries. Like Monroe said in the 1820s, we need to protect these Latin American and Caribbean countries from Europe. What Roosevelt is now saying is, yes, we absolutely need to protect these countries, even if we have to protect them from themselves, which of course is monumentally paternalistic and insulting. But the idea being, if we don't think what you're doing is the right thing to do, then we will invade your country, or at the very least, we will use our, behemoth economic power, which obviously is much stronger than any of these other countries, to kind of force you to do what we want. So now the United States, in essence, is kind of, at the very least, using economic imperialism to try to I guess, bully these countries around and force them to do what we want. Always with economic and diplomatic imperialism, but always with the threat of military imperialism as well. So one really good example of this is the Panama Canal. It used to be that if you wanted to trade something from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast of the United States, or the East Coast of the United States to Asia, you'd have to take a boat all the way around the southern tip of South America and come all the way back up. Well, there's a really thin strip of land right in between North and South America. For those of you who don't know your geography, you can take a look at a map or whatever. And it's the Panama Canal. I mean, it's the Panama, I guess, isthmus. I don't really know, actually. I don't really know what they'd be called. But anyways, a really small strip of land. Well, Panama wasn't its own country at that time. It was still part of Colombia. So the United States and Teddy Roosevelt goes to Colombia and says, we'd like to build a canal through this land because that would cut our boat trips like in half and make it much better for our, trading and so on and so forth. And Colombia said, no, we don't really want to do that. So then the United States, under Teddy Roosevelt, went to the people in the Panamanian region of Colombia and said, hey, don't you guys want to be your own independent country? And they were like, yeah. And we were like, well, we will support you if you want to have a revolt against Colombia. So we basically encouraged the Panamanian region of Colombia to declare its independence and to have a revolt. And we fully supplied them and supported them militarily so that Panama can become its own independent country. And then once it did, we were like, hey, do you want to let us build a canal? And they were like, sure, since you helped us become our own independent country. So we essentially, again, in a still yet another a different way, but still consistent with the definition, America used its military power, its military might to expand its economic interests. We wanted to build a canal that would be a lot better for American economic interest. Colombia would not let us do so. So we meddled, we used our military, we essentially created a brand new country called Panama, and they built a canal through it and maintained control of that canal for decades and decades later on. So this is a perfect example of Teddy Roosevelt's speaking softly and carrying a big stick. We tried diplomacy first with Colombia. They said no. So then we used our military in order to get what we wanted in the long run anyway. So we could see Teddy Roosevelt, an enthusiastic supporter, an enthusiastic defender, expansionist of American imperialism. Woodrow Wilson is going to be a little bit different. And Taft didn't really do a whole lot with imperialism. Taft, we don't really get into Taft too much, but he believed more in kind of economic imperialism, something called dollar diplomacy. He wasn't really as interested in kind of sending troops in places, but he would use like the strength of American banks to like give out loans and things to smaller countries that say, we'll only give you a loan. Don't you want to build more roads? Don't you want to build a canal? Don't you want to build a dam? We'll give you these loans if you agree to change these trading policies to be more beneficial to the United States or something like that. So that was Taft. He was more into the kind of the economic imperialism. Well, when Woodrow Wilson came in, we talked about how it's very difficult to discern a difference between the two Republican progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and then going into the Democratic progressive president. We were talking about kind of their domestic policy. They all kind of took the same approach. Well, when Woodrow Wilson came in, he was very strong in his anti-imperialist rhetoric. We said, we're all this imperialism stuff we got going on under Teddy and under Taft, we're not going to do that anymore. We're done with imperialism. We're not going to be messing around in other people's countries. This is a terrible idea. And the Democratic Party was really kind of more on the anti-imperialist side of things and on the pro-imperialist side of things. And being a Democratic candidate for president, he said, you know what? That's exactly correct. That's exactly what we're going to do. Well, then after he became president, things started to get kind of messy in Mexico. A civil war broke out in Mexico. We don't need to get into the details of all of that because it's not a Mexican-American history class. Although, if you get a chance to take a it's not a Mexican history class, but if you ever get a chance to take a Mexican history class, you should, because it's a fascinating history. Oof, that's a really interesting country. That probably won't happen until college. Anyway, Mexico basically descends into a civil war during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, and to oversimplify things dramatically, but it's good enough for what we need to understand about the Mexican Civil War. One of the sides is far more friendly to American business, and the other side is far more hostile to American business. So Woodrow Wilson, who said, oh man, we got to stop being involved in other countries, we got to stop all this imperialism stuff, all of a sudden he becomes very interested in Mexico and the Mexican Civil War. So, next thing you know, American soldiers are showing up in Mexico, fighting on one side over the other, so on and so forth. And here you see Uncle Sam hopping the border, getting involved in the Mexican-American War in one political cartoon. You see Woodrow Wilson, who famously was a college professor before he was president, giving a lecture to, someone who's obviously representing a Mexican soldier, Mexican military. And here we have Woodrow Wilson basically going along with the same kind of imperialist attitudes and mindset that he had advocated against and that were so popular among Teddy and Taft. Although each of the presidents did it a little bit differently. Teddy was, speak softly and carry a big stick. Taft was dollar diplomacy or kind of economic imperialism. Wilson will be a military interventionist, but he's not enthusiastic about it. It's something he's kind of dragged into as he feels compelled to support American business interests in Mexico as Mexico kind of descends into a civil war. So all three of the progressive presidents kind of continue on imperialism into their presidencies. And the United States is often running as an imperialist power, as one of an emerging military power on the global scale. That brings us to part 3, in which Woodrow Wilson, as we just mentioned, was a reluctant interventionist. Is obviously, as anybody you know anything about World War I, which hopefully you do, because you're supposed to learn about it last year. We will see Woodrow Wilson, who started as a non-interventionist, is very is gonna be forced to intervene in something even bigger than the Mexican Civil War. So, those of you who learned about World War I last year, you know the basic story. In essence, what happened in World War I in Europe, again, this is not a European history class, so we don't get into the details, but pretty much all of Europe had created all of these like intertangling alliances, which was such a mess of a rat's nest that as soon as one person from one country sneezed on someone from another country, it basically took the entire damn continent into a world war, right? So leading up to World War I, Europe had overly militarized, had built up a ton of armaments, and everybody was kind of itching to go to war. And like I said, everybody was basically aligned with somebody else. So in essence, the analogy I like to think about for World War I is two groups of very kind of like broed out masculine dudes at their bachelor party, at 2 different bachelor parties in Vegas, right? So it's just like 2 groups of like 10 dudes who are just like all broed out and like very masculine and whatever. And as soon as like one guy from one of the groups accidentally bumps into the other guy from the other group, then everybody's got to support their boy and get their boys back. And now everybody's swinging punches in the middle of the casino, right? So that's essentially World War I. And you guys remember the story. They were going to assassinate some guy and then they messed it up and then they wanted to get a sandwich and ran into him later on and then assassinated him. Anyway, so the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated and then bing, bang, boom, the whole thing falls apart. Now, at this point, none of that has anything to do with the United States. The United States is kind of watching all of this mess unfold from across the Atlantic Ocean. And the initial reaction from the United States is there's absolutely no way whatsoever we're going to get involved in that mess. It is messy, it is gross, it is dangerous, has nothing to do with us. There's no chance we're going to get involved in that at all. We're busy, taking over the Philippines. We're busy taking over the Caribbean. We're basically making sure things in Mexico go our way. We're taking over Hawaii. We're taking over the Philippines. We're interested in economics over in China and in Asia. What's going on in Europe is not our business. We're going to leave it alone. So when World War I breaks out, which starts, I believe, in 1914, but I'm no expert on World War I, but I'm pretty sure 1914. Woodrow Wilson calls for neutrality. He says all Americans need to be neutral in fact as well as in name. Keep the U.S. out of war. War in Europe, peace in America. God bless Wilson. Wilson is going to keep us out of the war. We are going to be neutral. Now, of course, if anybody knows anything about the history of World War I, we do not stay neutral. So essentially what happens is we kind of get dragged kicking and screaming into World War I. We're very intent on staying out, and then all of a sudden things start to happen, which kind of force us to get involved. So it's kind of a step-by-step process. So step 1 is just looking at the numbers. In 1916, first of all, it should be noted that in our neutrality, the United States continues to trade with England and France, which is on one side of the war, and we continue to trade with Germany, which is on the other side of the war. And we continue to give loans to England and France, which is on one side of the war. And we continue to give loans to Germany, which is on the other side of the war. So that's neutrality. We are continuing to engage economically with both sides of this thing. It's none of our business. We're not going to get involved. However, if you look at the numbers in 1916, we're 2 years into the war, the total amount of trade and loans the United States has with England and France is $5.7 billion. Meanwhile, trade and loans to Germany in that same year were $56 million. So the United States can go around all day long and say, I'm neutral, I'm neutral, I'm neutral, I'm neutral, I'm neutral. But I'm giving $5.7 billion to one side and $56 million to the other side. It's a pretty clear sign. That's like a dad saying, you know, I love both of my kids the same. I don't love one kid more than the other, so on and so forth. But then you give one kid like 300 hugs a day and the other kid like one hug a week. You go to one kid's like all of their like violin recitals and you never go to any other kids' baseball games, right? Like you and one kid like do Legos together and the other kid, anytime he wants to play with you, you say, oh, I'm busy doing something else. So you could say you love both your kids the same, but what do your actions actually show? The United States can say that they're neutral, but 5.7 billion compared to 56 million is a pretty clear sign. So before he started making lovely, wonderful children's books, you can see that Dr. Seuss was a political cartoonist, and you can see his belief of what the Neutrality Act was going to do. The Neutrality Act, again, could say that it was fine, but as long as we're sending aid, which is going to help win the war in a much greater amount to one side than the other, that's not neutral, and that's going to get us dragged into the war. Germany is no dummy. Germany sees what's going on here, and Germany makes a proclamation that says, yo, we're going to start sinking. Oh, and Germany has these new really exciting things called U-boats or underwater boats, which are submarines, and they start sinking a whole bunch of ships. And they say any ship that is coming into or out of England, we're going to sink it. We don't care whose ship it is or what's on it, but we're going to start sinking ships. So watch out. So we start to see a whole bunch of ships, either British ships or American ships, but British ships with Americans on it, start to get attacked by German U-boats. We're going to see the number of these attacks increase dramatically in 1915, 1916. One particular attack that's going to stand out is an attack on a boat called the Lusitania, which is going to kill 128 Americans. By the way, there's a really, really great book. Oh man, what is it called? It's by Erik Larson, and it's called something. Anyway, it's about the sinking of the Lusitania. It's a really good book. Erik Larson has a bunch of really, really great books about history that I can, yeah. Anyway, this is actually his third best book, but it's really good. And I can't remember what it's called, but it's really, really good. Anyway, it's all about the sinking of the Lusitania, and it's like super intense. You should check it out. As soon as I remember what it's called, I'll tell you. So anyway, the sinking of Lusitania is going to end up killing 128 Americans, and this is going to be alarming for the United States. More and more American boats will be sunk throughout 1915 and 1916. And Woodrow Wilson, who continues to claim neutrality, will quietly approve a $1 billion military buildup, because what Woodrow Wilson knows, which is what we know, and one of the things you have to know by the time you finish AP US history, is that Americans don't like when people mess with our boats. We didn't like it when people messed with our boats in the War of 1812. We didn't like it when people messed with our boats in the Spanish-American War. And we don't like when people mess with our boats, or even just boats that we have Americans on at the beginning of World War I. So this is going to start the realization among people in positions of power that we are probably not going to be able to stay out of this thing, right? As long as we're going to be economically connected to this war, it's going to be nearly impossible not to be dragged in militarily to this war. So Wilson starts to build up the military. Well, the next thing that happens is really going to be kind of the dagger that's going to really kind of end the whole thing. And that is the Zimmerman telegram, which I'm sure you remember. There was a note that was intercepted by the British and then handed over to the Americans called the Zimmerman telegram. And this was a note that was being sent from Germany to Mexico. And it was potentially an alliance between the two countries. It was Germany urging Mexico to invade the United States to try to regain the land that was lost in the Mexican-American War, which, by the way, was like 70 years earlier. So, I mean, you got to get over it at some point. But anyway, and the whole idea was that Germany wanted to force the United States to become preoccupied with what was going on in the southern border so that it would not have the resources or the money or the energy to be able to get involved in what was going on in the United States. But like I said, that telegram was intercepted. Actually, it says here it was intercepted by the Americans. I think that was a mistake on my part. I'm pretty sure it was intercepted by the British, who then handed it over to the Americans. And of course, at that point, then it's very difficult for us to stay neutral, right? We want to stay neutral. We want to stay neutral. We want to stay neutral. But people are sinking our boats. They're killing Americans on the Atlantic Ocean. And now Germany is trying to convince Mexico that it should invade the United States. So by the time we get to April 6, 1917, we will have declared war on Germany. House vote of 373 to 50 passes a joint resolution. War is declared by the United States. Now, in the election of 1916, when Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election, the whole thing was about Wilson kept us out of the war. Vote for Wilson. He'll keep us out of the war. We're not going to get involved in war. Wilson's going to keep us out of the war, keep us out of the war, keep us out of the war. And then like a year later, boom, we're in war. But, you know, if they're going to sink our boats and they're going to try to get Mexico to invade us, I mean, what other options do we have? So the United States is going to get involved in World War I, and this is going to be a critical piece to the overall story here. If the United States is emerging as a global military power, it is one thing to be imperialist power and slowly but surely use your your military influence to support or expand your economic interests, as we saw in Cuba, as we saw in the Philippines, as we saw in Hawaii, as we saw in China, as we saw in Panama and a variety of other places. But now we are getting dragged into this kind of global conflict that is of even greater importance and even more kind of noticeable on the global stage than just kind of starting to spread our wings from an imperialist perspective. Now we're getting dragged into this great contest on the global scale. So Americans will join the war and will give the Allies, the Germans and the French and their allies, much needed reinforcements. And essentially, the United States entering the war is what ends the war. We will send 4 million quote unquote doughboys. I don't remember why the people who fought in the war were called doughboys. I looked it up at one point and I've forgotten. Anyway, 4 million doughboys will serve in World War I. As a side note, 1 out of every 5 of those are born outside of the United States. Remember, we are still very much right in the kind of at the tail end of that massive immigration tidal wave to the United States that we talked about a few chapters back, right? Like that took us right up into World War I. So 1 out of 5 Americans that fight in the war are people who actually mostly came from Europe and then immigrated to America and then got in a uniform and went back to Europe to fight. So 20% of the people who fought. But 4 million will fight in the war. 500 or 50,000 will die from combat. 63,000 will die from disease. So over 100,000 total will die in the war. But really, it's the United States getting involved in the war that ends up winning the war. And it's not because the United States comes in with this new kind of clever strategy that nobody thought of before. And it's not because American soldiers are better at fighting than the British and the French. It's not because we have better military weapons. It's because this war has been going on for what, like 4 or 5 years at this point. Everybody on both sides is absolutely exhausted. And whichever side can get a little bit of a boost of energy is going to win, right? I hate to keep going back to this, but, and especially because I don't even like the sport, but imagine it's like the 14th round of 2 boxers and they're both so exhausted they could barely lift their arms to swing at each other. And then one side gets someone to like run in and just like kick the other guy in the chest. He's just gonna fall over and collapse, right? And that's essentially what America joining World War I is. Regardless of the reason why the United States helped win World War I, by doing so, they're going to be applauded, celebrated, hoisted on the shoulders of everybody who was on the winning side, and now seen as this military powerhouse and this hero, right? The United States is now going to be kind of solidly installed as one of the global superpowers because, it kind of started in 1898 with us picking a fight with Spain, winning and taking their lunch money, then us slowly but surely kind of continuing to spread our influence militarily in order to support our economic interests on the global stage. And now we are going to be the heroes of World War One. So this is really kind of, again, solidifying us as one of the military powers of the world. So by the time we get to 1919, let's just call it 1920 to make it clean, the United States has very clearly established itself as one of the biggest, most influential economic powers in the world and one of the biggest, most influential military powers in the world. So that's where we are at this point, but it's going to become even more, the United States position in the world is going to become even more emphasized in the post-war era than it was even during the war. But a couple things to take note of. Let's connect the dots on this slide between Woodrow Wilson, the progressive president, and Woodrow Wilson, the war president. So again, as a progressive, you already are comfortable with this idea that the government should be expanded, the government should be bigger, the government should be more robust, the government should be more powerful. Now, as we've talked about that up to this point, that's all sounded pretty good because so far we've talked about a bigger, more robust, more active government that was supposed to be protecting the people from the excesses of big business, from the negative impacts of industrialization. And that's a good thing. I think most people would agree that that's a good thing for government to do. But if you find yourself in a position now where you already have this sense that the government should be big and robust and active, and now it's wartime, and during wartime, oftentimes the American population is more lenient with the government being even more big, even more robust, right? So Woodrow Wilson is going to take advantage of the wartime to take his kind of progressive ideology and really push it to the max as much as he possibly can. And in some places, he's going to overstep. He's going to go too far, and it's going to start to make people a little bit uncomfortable with this idea of a big, strong, robust government, which is going to lead us up to the election of 1920 in a future chapter, but I just kind of want to set it up here. So during World War I, they create the War Industries Board, which directs military production. In other words, it tells businesses what they should be making and how much they should make of it. Now, that is a huge, huge step in the direction of government control, because it's one thing to regulate businesses and say you have to treat your employees in a way where they're safe and healthy. You have to pay your employees a certain amount so they have a living wage. You have to make sure you're not polluting. You can't make them work too many hours, and kind of have just general guidelines of how to have a workplace or a factory that's not, just destroying your your employees. That's one thing, right? But it's a whole nother thing for the government to tell businesses how much, what they can make and how much they can make of it. I mean, that's essentially what a lot of the authoritarian communist nations are gonna try to do during the 1900s. So that's a pretty big step in a direction. He's going to create the National Labor Board, which is going to establish the 8-hour workday and equal pay for women who are working in businesses that are contracting with the military. He's going to create the Railroad Administration, which is essentially going to be a government takeover of the railroad, just temporarily, but the Railroad Administration will do that. So this is the old populist pipe dream, the old populist country pipe dream of that the government should take over the railroad. He's going to do that. The Food Administration is essentially going to be the government taking over kind of agricultural production of food. So this is all a monumental expansion of government control over the economy. And again, that's in essence what progressivism is about, but there is a point at which you go too far with it, and it's going to start to make people uncomfortable. Beyond that, during the war, they're going to create the Committee on Public Information and the Sedition Act of 1918. The Committee on Public Information is basically just a government propaganda machine to create all of this stuff to, convince everybody that the Germans are evil monsters and so on and so forth, which doesn't go over too well with German immigrants. And that the Americans are the heroes. So basically this government propaganda machine, which also makes people feel uncomfortable. But the Sedition Act of 1918, just like the Sedition Act all the way back in the 1790s, is going to limit criticism of the government. Woodrow Wilson is going to shut down hundreds of newspapers that are critical of him or critical of the war. So people who are anti-imperialist or people who are anti-war are now seeing their First Amendment rights, their free speech rights being greatly infringed upon. Wilson's administration will see a huge attack on people's civil liberties. Now, again, oftentimes during wartime, people tend to be a little more lenient with that. During the Civil War, Lincoln did some stuff that was probably violation of the Constitution as well, and people kind of went along with it. Woodrow Wilson, in this case, is also doing stuff that's clearly a violation of the First Amendment. So the point being, he's going to take his kind of progressive mindset during this wartime and really kind of take it he's going to take it too far. There's going to be a backlash against that. More on that later on. A very important question with World War I is, what were the different effects of African Americans, Mexican Americans, and women's civilian mobilization during World War I? So the war itself is one thing, but what's going on at home is significant. And one of the things that we're going to see during World War I is, as we know, in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and into the first decade of the 1900s, there's been this huge industrial growth, this huge industrial expansion. But World War I is going to take that and pump it up on steroids, because always when it comes to war, there's going to be a huge demand for more manufacturing for a variety of things. So when there's more manufacturing, there's going to be more manufacturing jobs. There's going to be more demand for agricultural products. There's going to be more agricultural jobs. Generally speaking, in times of war, the economy booms and there's more opportunities for jobs, which often means more opportunities for jobs for people from all stripes, especially because a lot of the young men who normally would be fighting or be working in factories are off in Europe fighting the war. So first of all, let's take a look at how the war impacted African Americans. First of all, 400,000 African Americans are going to fight in World War I. That's 13% of the entire fighting force is going to be African Americans. Now, one of the things we'll see throughout the 1900s is, as communities of color, particularly African Americans, go off to fight in wars overseas, oftentimes the wars are being sold, especially in those propaganda machines, as wars to save the world for democracy, right? So now you have African Americans who are going overseas to fight on behalf of democracy. Then they come back home and it's like, well, wait a minute, if we're fighting for democracy overseas, what's going on here? So oftentimes we'll see, as African Americans go off to fight in World War I and World War II, those are going to be two major kind of catalysts for African Americans starting to demand civil rights and equality and democracy at home as well. But the real significant impact of World War I on African Americans is the jobs. There's going to be so many industrial jobs in the North and in the West that it's going to be the first time that African Americans really truly can, in significant numbers, leave the South, because there never really has been opportunities for African Americans to go get jobs in factories in the North and the West. First of all, immigrants did most of that work. The immigration faucet has been shut off significantly during the war. And there's just such a huge demand for jobs. So all of a sudden we'll see 400,000 African Americans migrate from the South to the North and to the West. So this is a great opportunity for African Americans to finally get out of the Jim Crow South, to finally get out of sharecropping, et cetera, et cetera. But what we will see in a chapter coming up is they will also, not surprisingly, face harsh discrimination in the North. It's not like people in the North want African Americans living there too. It's not like people in the North are not racist. And we will see a whole kind of wildfire of race riots. Race riots are going to break out in cities across the United States during this time period as African Americans move into cities where there hadn't been a whole lot of African Americans before. So new opportunities for African Americans when it comes to jobs in industrial cities, and this opportunity to get out south of the Great Migration. But of course, that then leads to new discriminations as well. For Mexican immigrants who will become Mexican Americans, there's going to be a huge demand for agricultural jobs. So we will see 100,000 Mexicans immigrate to the United States in search of work, but we'll also see many of the Mexican farm workers who were already here, or who were born here, who are natural born American citizens, or who had immigrated previously, who were farm workers, are going to do something similar to what the African Americans did. They're going to see opportunities in industrial jobs, which are better paying, and they're going to go there. So there's When it comes to Mexicans, there's kind of two things going on. One, Mexicans are going from agricultural jobs to urban jobs, but also a lot of Mexican immigrants are coming in and taking over those agricultural jobs. Of course, another huge moment for women, as I've told you a bunch of times before, anytime you see a huge burst in industrialization, you will see a huge increase in the number of women who are going into the public sphere to go to work. We've seen it happen a handful of times before, and here we see it to a larger extent than we ever have in American history. 1 million women will join the workforce during World War I. 8 million women who are already in the workforce will be upgraded to higher paying industrial jobs, not just secretarial jobs or things like that, actual industrial jobs. This is really going to be one of the factors that leads to the 19th Amendment, which we talked about briefly at the end of last chapter. The 19th Amendment is one of the 4 progressive amendments. It is going to be women's suffrage, where women will get the right to vote. Every time we see a boom of industrialization, you see more and more women go into the public sphere. When women go into the public sphere for economic reasons, it doesn't take that long for the political realities of the public sphere to also become a part of that conversation. So we will see women begin to demand the right to vote to an even greater extent than they had been before, as more and more women go into the public sphere to work, more and more women are going to the public sphere to advocate for the right to vote. The National American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Party will get more and more members, will get more and more support, and will push for the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which will be ratified in 1920. So there are new opportunities for a variety of groups of Americans who traditionally are those who don't get as many opportunities. And so we see here with World War I, those opportunities do come. Not always, especially in the case of African Americans, without some sort of a backlash against it, but new opportunities for these groups of people. And that brings us to part 4, which is quite short. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the United States, we talked about extensively, has now become one of the most influential and powerful countries economically as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The United States has become one of the most influential and powerful countries militarily as a result of imperialism and then our involvement in helping win World War I. But it's really the post-World War I moment that establishes the United States as a global superpower as well. In this case, in terms of diplomacy. In the aftermath of World War I, Woodrow Wilson will become an international superhero. People across the world, especially in Europe, will praise and adore Woodrow Wilson as a representative of the United States, which helped put an end to this horrific, awful war. So Woodrow Wilson now sees himself in this position to really kind of become a global peacemaker. From the guy who came into office saying, we don't want to get involved in international military affairs, from the guy who in World War I got started, said, we're not going to get involved in that. Now, World War I's aftermath, has decided that he's going to become the center of the entire post-war conversation, and he's going to try to use this moment to create a long-lasting global peace. So he creates something called the 14 points, and I don't have all of the 14 points here. I have some of the significant ones, but basically the peace talks at Versailles that follow the war. He doesn't want to just have this be a thing where we, bring this thing to an end and now everything is back to normal and we just move on. He says, let's take this as an opportunity to really rethink the kind of global structure, the international structure, the way we interact with one another, and change the things that created this. Let's make sure that something like this never ever happens again by thinking about what caused it and trying to create a global community, a global set of rules that will prevent this from happening again. And that makes a whole lot of sense, right? If your house were to burn down, you'd want to be like, okay, what made the house burn down? Now let's rebuild it in a way where it won't burn down again, right? So some of the key pieces of the 14 points are open diplomacy. So making sure that all countries can have diplomacy with all other countries, that wouldn't have all these kind of intertangling alliances, or if you're on our side, you can't be on their side, et cetera, et cetera. The freedom of the navigation of the seas, so everybody can, move around as they will. That's going to help bring about economic relationships. And there's a general belief that countries that have economic relationships with one another don't go to war with one another. So the more we could expand economic relationships, the better. So freedom of navigation of the seas is related to that. Also, you can see the removal of trade barriers is also related to that. The more we can get countries trading with one another, the more we can make sure that those countries don't go to war with one another. We need to dramatically reduce the number of armaments people have, the number of weapons that people have. Part of the thing that led to the war was that people were kind of all jacked up on this big arms increase that happened before. So we need to do the opposite now. And one of the very key pieces here is we need to let those who lost the war have national self-determination. We shouldn't turn the countries who lost the war into kind of like the punching bags for the people who won the war, or make it so that they're now kind of territories that are controlled by the people who won the war. It should be like, okay, you lost, that sucks, but we're not going to punish you or hurt you too bad. We're going to let you kind of have determination over your own nation as the war goes on. But the most significant piece of the 14 points was a suggestion of creating something called the League of Nations, which would be kind of, this body, this organization where representatives from all of the countries in the world would get together regularly and settle disputes between countries, so that instead of going to war with one another, we can use diplomacy to work through these things. Now, one of the interesting things that's going to happen with the League of Nations is a lot of the European countries will think it's a grand idea and they will all join it. And even though it was Woodrow Wilson's idea, the United States will not join it because Congress doesn't like the idea. So Congress will not allow the United States to join the League of Nations because partly one of the big things about World War I is we got involved in this kind of international conflict. Even though we became the global heroes and we won the war, still a lot of people died, and we kind of want to avoid doing something like that ever again. So anything like the League of Nations or something that automatically gets us kind of committed to some sort of international organization, the American people and Congress are a little bit queasy about. So even though Woodrow Wilson is the one that came up with the League of Nations, the idea for the League of Nations, the United States will not join the League of Nations. It will exist. Most of the European countries will be part of it, but the United States will not be. Interestingly, as much as Wilson is absolutely adored in Europe and he goes around and makes speeches all over the place and thousands of people come up and come around and cheer him on and all this other stuff, when he goes back to the United States, he goes around the country trying to get people to buy into the League of Nations, and he doesn't have any success, obviously, as we see, and he actually works so hard he ends up having a stroke and becomes incapacitated. And there's this interesting story about Wilson where he basically is incapacitated, but they don't tell anybody. So basically his wife is running the country, and anytime any of his aides or anybody from Congress comes to see him, she always says, well, he's not feeling well right now, so why don't you tell me what you want to tell him, and then I'll go tell him. And she would like go into his room and pretend like she was talking to him, and then come back out and be like, well, he said this and this and this. So no one really knew at the time, except for her and his doctor, that she was actually the one running the country, which is highly unconstitutional, but that's what happened. Anyway, the League of Nations will become a thing, but the United States will not be part of it, which will be a problem. But overall, the point here being that the entire post-war peace agreement was really organized by the United States, by Woodrow Wilson. And so you have it here that not only has the United States become one of the most powerful economic countries in the world, not only has the United States become one of the most powerful military powers in the world. I'm saying powerful powers, which is annoying. But anyway, I'm stuck with it now. So not only have we become one of the most powerful economic countries in the world, not only have we become one of the most powerful military countries in the world, but we are now one of the most powerful and influential diplomatic countries in the world. So World War I and kind of the 2 or 3 decades leading up to it is this moment where the United States really ascends to becoming one of, not quite the superpower, not quite the center of the global community, but one of the countries that is one of the global powers and one of the countries that is part of the kind of the center of gravity for the world. So that's chapter 21. That's the deal. I hope you enjoyed it. Everybody, I'll see you next time. Have a great day.